What's going on, Bottom Line viewers? It's Mitch here of the Bottom Line View with my NFL Stardom and Situm Week 4 video. I'm here to give you 5 starts for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position, as well as sits for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you hit that like button, Gronk spike it, as well as subscribe to the channel if you're new, and join the Bottom Line View movement. We just hit 3,500 subscribers. It would be awesome if we could get to 3,600 within the next week. That should be a goal. Start 'em and sit 'em for week number 4. Here we go. Quarterback starts this week. I have Trevor Siemian versus Oakland, Russell Wilson versus Indianapolis, Phillip Rivers versus the Philadelphia Eagles, Dak Prescott versus the Rams, and Kirk Cousins versus the Chiefs. Trevor Siemian has been amazing at home. Trevor Siemian has 6 touchdowns in 2 home games this season. He played the Chargers and the Cowboys defense. The Chargers defense, another AFC West rival, superior to the Raiders defense. The Raiders have allowed an average of almost 21 points to quarterbacks after 3 weeks, including getting shredded in prime time in Washington against Kirk Cousins. I love Trevor Siemian this week. If he's still out there in your waiver wire, pick him up, start him against Oakland. I'm not a fan of Oakland's secondary, and I think that Denver's offensive line is going to be able to handle Khalil Mack in company on the pass rush. I think Trevor Siemian is going to have a similar game to the way that he performed in week number 1 and number 2. Not so much number 3, a little bit of a downfall, but when Siemian's at home, he plays well. Russell Wilson versus the Colts. Indy has given up more than 300 yards or multiple touchdown passes in every single game this season. Russell Wilson, this should be a game which is the best game of his season. He did have a good fantasy output last week against Tennessee. A lot of that was in garbage time points. In this one, I think this is going to be his actual best game in real life and fantasy this season. The Colts defense is not great. They should be able to contain their pass rush. They should at least be able to block enough for Russell Wilson to produce some fantasy points this week. Like I said, they've given up 300 yards or multiple touchdown passes in every single game this season. They've played the likes of Carson Palmer, Deshaun Kaiser, and another bad quarterback, which isn't coming to my head right now. But Russell Wilson's going to have a big week against the Colts. Phillip Rivers versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Phillip Rivers has averaged 21 fantasy points in his first 2 games against Denver and Miami. Yes, he had a bad game against the Chiefs, but the Chiefs are actually pretty decent defense. Rivers is at home against the Eagles defense that just got torched in their stadium against Eli Manning. And if I remember correctly, a lot of people were saying Eli, including myself, needs to retire. And also, he was terrible in the first 2 weeks, and he lit up the Eagles in week 3. I think the Chargers, Anthony Lynn, Phillip Rivers, look at that tape. They see what they did. They take advantage of this secondary. The Eagles secondary is weak. The Chargers O-line is actually pretty decent. And I think they give Phillip Rivers enough time against a good pass rush to deliver down the field to their good receivers against this weak secondary. I think Phillip Rivers can have a bounce-back performance this week. Dak Prescott versus the LA Rams. Dak, speaking of bounce-back performances, had one last week. The Rams defense was lit up by none other than the great Brian Hoyer last week from the 49ers. The Rams defense looks terrible. Dak Prescott, bounce back. I think the big thing for the Cowboys this week is they'll be able to run the ball and they'll be able to establish a run game, which will allow Dak Prescott to play to the best of his ability, which gives him the ability to work off play action, which he's really good at, and use his legs to use the bootlegs and everything else. I think Dez Bryant finally is not playing a top-tier corner in this game and will have a good game, which allows Dak to have a high ceiling. So I like Dak this week against the Rams. Kirk Cousins versus the Chiefs. The Chiefs actually rank 24th in the NFL in pass yards given up and 28th in total yards given up. Cousins broke out last week against the Raiders, and I think that there's more from that to come. They didn't even have Terrell Pryor involved in that game, I think we might see a little bit more of him in this game, but I really, really, really like what I saw from Kirk Cousins last week. I think they just understand. And the thing about the Redskins is they've gotten better every single week. That's defensively and offensively. This game's going to be a lot closer than people think. And if the Chiefs indeed do get a lead, Cousins will have to come from behind and try and pass the ball to come back in the game. So I like Kirk Cousins versus the Chiefs. Two other starts at the quarterback position. Jay Cutler versus the Saints. Jared Goff versus the Dallas Cowboys. Reason being, just throwing these out there real quick, Jay Cutler is facing probably the worst secondary in the entire NFL. The game's at home, and he should do something in this game. I really like the receiver matchups for Miami, which we'll get to in a little bit, and I think that Cutler will be able to take advantage of that down the field. Jared Goff versus the Dallas Cowboys. Jared Goff's played really, really well so far this season and deserves some respect. Sean McVay deserves even more respect for what he's done with this offense. He's a really good offensive coach, and he's going to draw up some plays to beat this Dallas secondary that I think is not very good. Let's go to the quarterback sits. Ben Roethlisberger versus Baltimore, Derek Carr versus Denver, Jameis Winston versus New York Giants, Alex Smith versus Washington, Cam Newton versus New England. Ben Roethlisberger versus Baltimore. In his past 5 games in Baltimore, Roethlisberger has averaged just 248 passing yards with 5 total touchdowns and 7 interceptions. Roethlisberger is basically a turnover machine when it comes to not only playing on the road, but playing in Baltimore. He does not like playing in Baltimore. The Pittsburgh Steelers have lost 4 of the last 5 games they played against the Ravens, and the offense hasn't been so hot so far this season. They didn't look good against Chicago. They didn't look good against the Vikings, and they didn't look good in week 1. This week against the best defense they've played so far this season, it doesn't get any better, especially in Baltimore, like I said, where Roethlisberger struggles. Sit Roethlisberger this week. Derek Carr versus the Denver Broncos. The past 5 games against the Broncos, Carr has averaged just 184 passing yards with 6 total touchdowns. Carr has struggled against the Broncos, especially in big games. This is a big game. Now, the Raiders had some success against the Broncos last year because they were able to run the ball. But as I'll get to in a little bit, the Broncos have been amazing against the run so far this year. I don't think that's going to open up Derek Carr's ability to pass the ball. I actually expect the Raiders to struggle heavily in Denver this game on offense. I did not like what I saw against Washington. Washington has a similar defensive scheme to Denver's. They play a 3-4. They have those rushers on the outside. They have some decent coverages. And Washington's defense is kind of underrated, which we'll get to. But Derek Carr against Denver, not a fan. Jameis Winston versus the Giants. The Giants have only surrendered an average of 188.7 passing yards this season. The Giants secondary is safe to say it's very good. Jameis has not been very good. He's actually been really bad, especially with turning the football over. And the Giants defense is going to force turnovers. They need to. They're a desperate unit. They're a desperate team. The Giants need to win a game. I know it's back in Tampa Bay, and Jameis wasn't all that bad week 1. That was against the Bears secondary, not against the Giants secondary with multiple Pro Bowl players and multiple All-Pros. I think the Giants will really shut down those wide receiver targets, and Jameis will struggle in this game. Alex Smith versus Washington. As I mentioned, Washington's defense is underrated. 2 of the last 3 quarterbacks this season versus Washington have been held to less than 11 fantasy points. I know Alex Smith has been pretty good this year for fantasy purposes, but this game I think he comes back a little bit down to earth. I understand it's at home, but Washington's defense is really underrated. I think they'll get some pressure from the edges, from their outside pass rushers, their outside linebackers, Ryan Kerrigan and Preston Smith. I think Josh Norman, he plays cover 1, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4. And I think Josh Norman and this defense is really going to have to prove itself once again. We saw how angry and vicious it played against the Raiders. I expect them to take that same approach into Kansas City. Cam Newton versus New England. Cam only scored 7 fantasy points against New Orleans last week. 7. New Orleans. Arguably the worst defense in the NFL. And I know that New England's defense, especially against the pass, has been terrible. But Cam Newton looks hurt. He doesn't look mobile. And he has two of his best receivers injured in Kelvin Benjamin and Greg Olsen. This doesn't look good for the Panthers offense. Their offensive line's been terrible. Cam Newton's been inaccurate. And like I said, he's hurt. Don't start Cam Newton this week. My running back starts for this week: Jay Ajayi versus New Orleans, Joe Mixon versus Cleveland, Christian McCaffrey versus New England, and Javarius Allen versus Pittsburgh. Jay Ajayi, the Saints defense has allowed the most scrimmage yards, 203 yards per game, and the most PPR points, 34, to running backs this season. This game is going to come down to, for the Dolphins, their game plan is going to be the run game. It's going to be keeping Drew Brees off the field so that he can't torch their terrible secondary. And they're going to have Jay Cutler hand the ball off to Jay Ajayi, hand the ball off to Jay Ajayi, throw a screen to Jay Ajayi. Very safe stuff for Jay Cutler, especially early on in this game until they let him unload down the field to guys like Devontae Parker, Kenny Stills, and Jarvis Landry. But in this game, it's mostly going to be about Jay Ajayi controlling this game. Typically, he plays a lot better at home, and they run the ball a lot better at home. And New Orleans is typically in the dome. They won't be in the dome in this game. I think Jay Ajayi will be able to run against this team. He'll be able to catch passes against this team. And I think he's going to be the ultimate weapon this week against the Saints, who have been terrible against running backs. Joe Mixon versus Cleveland. If Mixon leads the backfield in snaps, touches, and PPR points like he did last week, I think he's going to be amazing. Now, backfield snaps last week, 34, touches 21. That led to the most PPR points last week. And this week, he plays the Browns, a defense that isn't very good. They got walloped by the Colts last week, like destroyed by Jacoby Brissett, of all people. And Joe Mixon, I think, finally going to be given that role entirely. He's such a weapon. He's such a beast in the receiving and the run game. I think he's going to have a breakout performance versus the Browns. Christian McCaffrey versus New England. New England has surrendered an average of 5.7 catches and the second most receiving yards and PPR points to opposing running backs after 3 weeks this season. New England struggles with receiving running backs. They're not good with it, and they allow a lot of easy completions, and even in the red zone they do so. I think that New England, their focus will be on McCaffrey. I don't know if they have the players to shut him down. McCaffrey's been really good in the receiving game so far, not so much the run game, but I think McCaffrey has another solid game, especially if Benjamin is banged up, and again, Olsen is out. So McCaffrey is that number one target in the receiving game, especially against a team like New England, who, like the stats say, have not been good in that category. Javarius Allen versus Pittsburgh. Allen is going to be the receiving back, very much like Christian McCaffrey. Terrence West will be shut down in this game. Pittsburgh's good against the run for the most part. I know they had a bad game last week, but it seems like Stephon Tuitt is going to be back. TJ Watt's also going to be back, which increases their size and skill in the front. I think Allen, who's been pretty good in receiving-wise this season, replacing Danny Woodhead in that role. Pittsburgh's allowed 18 catches so far to receiving running backs this year. I think Allen's going to have a decent game for you, and I would consider starting him as a flex or a running back too. Chris Carson versus the Colts. I think Chris Carson has another game in the Colts game where he's going to be a lot like San Fran. He had 20 carries, 93 yards in that game. I think Seattle will be up by enough points in this game will to be able to run the ball late, and they'll be able to put this one away with Chris Carson, who's been outsnapping and outperforming every running back on the Seahawks. Running back sits. Marshawn Lynch versus Denver. The Broncos have yet to allow a rushing touchdown despite matchups versus three elite running and running backs, running offenses and running backs: Melvin Gordon, Zeke Elliott, and LaShawn McCoy. They didn't allow a rushing touchdown against the Bills. They didn't allow a rushing touchdown against the Cowboys, and they didn't allow a rushing touchdown to Melvin Gordon. Do you think they'll really allow a rushing touchdown to Marshawn Lynch, who's only scored once against the New York Jets and has not been very good? I don't think so. I think the Broncos have been all over runners this year, all over Zeke Elliott, who ran for less yards than Tom Brady the week that they played the Broncos. LaShawn McCoy was not very effective last week. Despite all these touches, Marshawn Lynch doesn't get nearly as many touches as them. It's in Denver. Marshawn's not a good start this week. Lamar Miller versus the Tennessee Titans. He's losing more and more work to rookie Dante Foreman. Foreman saw 10 touches last week compared to Miller's 15. He's really, really getting close to being split in this backfield. And Lamar Miller, his whole thing was he was startable because he had a lot of value in terms of his touches. He was getting a lot of touches. But now that he's only averaging 3 yards per carry and only getting 15 touches and not running effectively, there's no use in starting him, especially against a defense that's good against the run, has a strong front. Guys like Jarrell Casey and them are going to shut down this run game of Lamar Miller and the Texans. Theo Riddick versus the Vikings. The Vikings have allowed the fewest PPR points, 13 points per game, to opposing running backs this season. Theo Riddick's all about the catching, all about the PPR, and when you don't have those PPR points available, he's most likely a sit. I think Amir Abdullah is slightly more startable just because he gets more touches in the run game, but even then, I don't like either of these guys particularly this week, especially not Theo Riddick, who even last year when he was the starter full-time, he wasn't effective against the Vikings. Frank Gore versus Seattle. He simply has not run well. Yes, he was good in week 1 and 2 when he was playing terrible defenses, but he has 49 carries for 145 yards. That's only a 3.0 yards per carry. Now he's going to Seattle in a game where they're going to have to pass the ball. The game script doesn't look good. The chances for a touchdown aren't very good. And he might get lit up against the Seattle Seahawks defense that has not performed well against the run and are really working on that area of their game. And I think at home, they're going to be motivated to shut that right down. Jonathan Stewart versus New England. New England has allowed 0 rushing touchdowns the last 2 games since Kareem Hunt went off against them. Expect a McCaffrey game. Expect a receiving game from the running back. Because, like I said, this New England offense is really, 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 really good, if you haven't noticed already. So, the Panthers are going to have to pass, and they're going to have to come back in this game. That means Cam Newton. That means McCaffrey. That doesn't mean Jonathan Stewart. Unless Jonathan Stewart gets a touchdown, which I don't see happening, he's not a good start here. My wide receiver starts this week. It's the slot receiver special here on the Bottom Line View. Adam Thielen versus Detroit, Jarvis Landry versus New Orleans, Willie Snead versus Miami, Golden Tate versus Minnesota, and Sterling Shepard versus Tampa Bay. Like I said, the slot receiver special. Adam Thielen versus Detroit. The slot corner for Detroit, Lawson, has given up an 101 passer rating this season. You put it in the fact that Detroit has Darius Slay on one side, who will most likely be covering Stephon Diggs. Adam Thielen will be the main target in this game. I think the Vikings will be hooked on a Thielen. He's been top 10 in receiving and fantasy points for receivers this season so far. I think that continues big time against Detroit in a game that I believe they can win, in a game that I believe they'll have to be scoring because I think Detroit can score some points. Jarvis Landry versus New Orleans. Slot receivers have had great success against New Orleans. Let's be honest, pretty much every receiver has. But in the first 2 games this season, Jarvis Landry, I know it wasn't great last week, but 26 targets in his first 2 games, and now playing a team that's terrible against slot receivers, Jarvis Landry's going to light it up big time. Willie Snead versus Miami. Willie Snead's back from suspension. There's a lot of question marks regarding if he's going to be full starter full time. I believe he's a lot more talented than Brandon Coleman. I believe he gives a huge element to this offense. He is a really good player. And even though he was suspended, I think Sean Payton realizes that, and he realizes what they can do offensively with Willie Snead. Keep in mind, he is the reason they let go of Brandon Cooks. The Dolphins have allowed a receiver to score double-digit fantasy points in each week this season. It very well could be Willie Snead this week. Golden Tate versus Minnesota. The Vikings are tied for allowing the most receptions, receiving yards, and fantasy points to opposing receivers this season. Golden Tate won't have to draw Xavier Rhodes because Xavier Rhodes will be facing Mike Evans. Or not Mike Evans. What am I talking about? Marvin Jones. He faced Mike Evans last week and did a really good job. That's what I meant to say. Marvin Jones is the big receiver on the outside for Detroit. Golden Tate is that slot receiver. Golden Tate is going to have a lot of targets in this game because Stafford and this offense will shy away from throwing to Roadside. Sterling Shepard versus Tampa Bay. Shepard should avoid Grimes and Hargraves this week since he plays in the slot. The Tampa Bay Bucs slot defender is not very good. Shepard, who had a huge week last week against the Eagles, will have another one this week thanks to OBJ being back, drawing away that coverage from the middle of the field. My wide receiver sits this week. Deshaun Jackson versus the Giants, Amari Cooper versus the Broncos, T.Y. Hilton versus the Seahawks, Pierre Garçon versus the Cardinals, and Martavis Bryant versus the Baltimore Ravens. Deshaun Jackson has struggled in his career versus cornerback DRC of the Giants. He's fast, he's long, he's tough to get by for Deshaun, who relies a lot on deep passes. I think that's the same thing that will happen this week. DRC will be all over him, and Jameis will be looking elsewhere. Amari Cooper versus the Broncos. In 4 career starts against the AFC West rival, Cooper has combined for 14 catches for 142 yards and just 1 touchdown. And by the way, Cooper has been terrible this year so far. I don't expect it to improve versus a defense that has Talib, Chris Harris, and Bradley Roby. The Broncos defense and secondary is really good. Von Miller is a disruptive force. It's hard to pass against this defense, especially at home. I don't know what's up with Cooper. I don't know if it's confidence. I don't know what it is, but he's not looking good, and especially against his secondary, sit him down. T.Y. Hilton versus the Seattle Seahawks. Hilton hasn't scored in the past 5 road games this season. Yes, he was amazing last week. Yes, amazing. But I just don't see him being amazing against the Seahawks, where he's going to be the guy that they center their game plan around and try and shut him down. And the Titans, it's not like they have a guy like Richard Sherman who's that good that can take away a guy. The Seattle Seahawks do have that guy, and despite Hilton being able to burn him with speed, I just don't see Jacoby Brissett being a quarterback really willing to take that shot and willing to burn a great corner like Sherman. Pierre Garçon versus the Cardinals. The lack of touchdowns in a difficult matchup for Garçon does concern me. He's still startable a little bit in PPR, but against Patrick Peterson, it's definitely a low ceiling start. He's going to get his targets because he's the only receiver in this offense, but against Patrick Peterson, it's going to be a tough time for him to get open. Martavis Bryant versus the Baltimore Ravens. In 11 career games away from Heinz Field, this might be actually surprising to you, Bryant has averaged only 3 receptions and 46 yards away from Pittsburgh. Against Baltimore, like I said, Ben has not been great. Bryant, I don't think will be great because he'll be playing tall corners that are tough and physical, and that's what matches up well with Bryant. Antonio Brown might have a good game. I don't see it happening with Martavis Bryant this week. My tight end starts, Jimmy Graham versus the Colts. Doug Baldwin is going to have to probably miss this game, and if he doesn't, he's going to be limited. So Graham is probably going to be the leading receiver on this team this week against a Colts defense that's not very athletic, not very good against tight ends. I think Graham can have another week like last week and build off of that to help establish Russell Wilson in this game. Charles Clay versus Atlanta. Clay is Tyrod Taylor's number 1 target and has been all season long. This is a game where the Bills are going to have to keep up on the scoreboard and score more points than they typically have to on the road in Atlanta against a good offense and a good team. I think Charles Clay is that number 1 choice, and in a shootout type of game or a game where they're having to come back, I like the number 1 target for the quarterback. Austin Seferian-Jenkins versus Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jags have allowed the 4th most tight end points allowed this season. Jenkins is tied for team lead in targets in 2017. So far, he only had 1 game, and he was tied for the team lead in targets in that game in his debut because he was suspended. I think this is an under-the-radar pickup for you this week and going forward because he's going to get a lot of targets, especially in PPR. Cam Brate versus the Giants. The Giants have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends this season, including the most catches in the league and a touchdown every single game. Don't have to say much more than that, but Cam Brate has actually run twice as many routes as O.J. Howard so far this season. He's definitely the number 1 receiving tight end in this offense, and if the Giants are going to execute anywhere in the passing game, it's not going to be against their corners, it's going to be against their linebackers of the Giants. Ryan Griffin versus the Tennessee Titans. The Titans have given up 10 receptions for 125 yards and a touchdown, and that was just last week, okay? Ryan Griffin was good against the Patriots. I think he'll be good against the Titans. Like I said, a defense that struggled against the Seahawks tight ends. Griffin seems to have rapport with Deshaun Watson, and he has no competition at that spot with C.J. Fedorowicz out. He could be a sneaky grab off the waiver wire and a start this week. My tight end sits. There's not many out there because, let's face it, there's so many options at tight end because they all suck. Let's just be honest. Okay? They're all just shots in the dark. The Chargers tight ends versus the Eagles. There's only been 1 tight end since the start of the 2016 season to have over 5 receptions or 55 yards receiving, and that was Travis Kelce. Jack Doyle versus the Seattle Seahawks. Jack, meet Cam Chancellor. I don't see it happening against Earl and Cam in the middle of that defense when it didn't happen against the Browns. That's my stardom and situm for week number 4 of the 2017 NFL season. If you guys enjoyed, it's Mitch of the Bottom Line View. Like the video, subscribe to the channel for more NFL content, and make sure you hit that notification bell for more Bottom Line View and the latest updates with our latest videos. It's Mitch. Tune in to the Sunday Night Football recap this Sunday, and much more going on the Bottom Line View. Peace out.